So, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue today on this spreadsheet in which I show how to estimate the fertility rates. And just a quick announcement. So overall, the grades for exam 2 were really good. That's awesome. I just suggest you pushing even harder for the third exam because usually people have issues with the exam that contains life tables in the mortality chapter. Usually that topic of life tables and standardization that we're going to see in the next chapter, students have more trouble answering those. So just pay attention to that material, reread it and everything. That's my overall suggestion for this content that we're going to see in these next days or in these next weeks. So in the last class, I started showing you this spreadsheet here where we calculate series of fertility rates, the ones that we just discussed in the slides and the lectures. And the cells in yellow are the cells that we have that I collected information from different sources. So pretty much what we have here is the number of women in the US in a specific year by age group. This is the denominator of most of our formulas here. This one here is the number of births to women at these specific age groups. So these two sets of columns here, they are the main ones that we want to use, but also we go a little further by saying out of these babies that were born to this woman, these groups, all these women here in 2012, how many of them are baby girls? So out of 305,000 babies born to women between 15 and 19, 149,000 were girls. And another set of information that I'm going to talk to you in more detail is related to mortality. This mortality information is going to be a little bit difficult to understand at this point, but it's going to be clear for you when we talk about life tables in the mortality chapter. The midpoint, we pretty much just get the beginning of this age group here, plus the beginning of the next one, divided by 2. So this one here is pretty much 15 plus 20 divided by 2, as I mentioned before. If we simply get the overall number of births, if we add all these births that we experienced for this woman here in 2012, we have 3.9 million births to 73 million women. So just dividing this place by this, we have the general fertility rate, right? So it's pretty much adding this column and divided by the sum of this column multiplied by 1,000. So what we say is that for every 1,000 women in the US in 2012, we had almost 54 births, right? For every 1,000 women. And this calculation here is not done breaking down by age group. So if in specific societies we have more women in older age groups than others, this measure here does not control for that because it's pretty much getting these cells here and adding them up together, these ones here adding them up together and dividing one by the other. But we saw that if we want to, we know that the chances of having children by women vary by age. Between 15 and 49, it increases up to around ages of 25, 29, 30, 34, and then it is, starts to decline again. So in order to get the specific chances of women having children by age within these reproductive ages, we estimate the age-specific fertility rates. So the age-specific fertility rates, we pretty much just get the number of babies that were born to women between these ages and the number of women in that age group in the US in 2012. So we have that age-specific fertility rate of almost 0.03 here. So it's 0.03 births for every woman. We can also multiply it by 1,000. If we multiply by 1,000, we're going to have, in this result here, would be 29.4. So it would be 29.4 births for every 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19. And we do the same for all the other groups, and we see that the highest rates are for women between 25 and 29, and it's still high for women between 30 and 34, and then it starts to decline again. And with that information, age-specific fertility rates, we can calculate the total fertility rates. So the total fertility rates, we pretty much just add up these age-specific fertility rates and multiply by 5. Why do we multiply by 5? Because this chance here of having children is for a woman between 15 and 19 for 5 single ages, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. The same thing for the other age groups here, right? So we add them up here, and then afterwards we get the sum of all these age-specific fertility rates and multiply by 5. This is the most common measure of fertility that we usually hear. The total fertility rate is saying that if we get this hypothetical group of women, remember that hypothetical measure in demography, if we have a hypothetical group of women that experience these age-specific fertility rates between the ages of 15 and 49, they will have an average of 1.88 children. Right, so that's the correct interpretation for that. Because I remember, women who are now, who back in 2012 were 22, 24, they had these chances here of having children. But 5 years later, in 2017, that is not going to be their chances of having children. It's going to be a different one. This cohort here of women, we have another chance of having children, another age-specific fertility rate when they reach the ages of 25 and 29. So the interpretation of the total fertility rate is related to this hypothetical cohort. If I get a group of women and expose them to these age-specific fertility rates during their reproductive ages, they will have an average of 1.88 children. And then comes the reproduction indicators. The indicators that in the numerator, we take into account only female births, only daughter, not sons. So here we have the number of daughters born to women in these specific age groups. And the denominator is going to be the same, number of women in that specific age group. And we calculate this female births per woman, which is pretty much just dividing this number by this one here, the female births divided by the population of women, the number of women in that age group. And here, for example, we say that we have 0.014 births for every woman, 0.014 female births for every woman between 15 and 29 and 19. If we multiply this by 1,000, we say that for every 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19, we see around 14.3 female births based on data from 2012, okay? So that's interpretation of these age-specific fertility rates that take into account only female births. If we add them all, we just add them all here and multiply by 5, we have the gross reproduction rate. So the gross reproduction rate, we interpret also in that hypothetical cohort form. If we expose women to these age-specific fertility rates that take into account only female births, expose women to these age-specific fertility rates that take into account only female births throughout their reproductive ages, they will have an average of 0.9 daughters. That's what you're saying. Why do we put in the numerator in these reproduction rates and indicators only women? Because we want to know if the number of daughters born in a specific year will replace their mothers. So here we want to know if we have close to one daughter replacing the mother. And remember, the total fertility rate, we are counting boys as well. So the total fertility rate, these children will be replacing both the father and the mother. But because some of these women here will die before they reach the age of 49, they will not experience all these age-specific fertility rates to have children. We usually say that the fertility is below the replacement level when the total fertility rate is below 2.1. Why 2.1 and not 2? Exactly because a lot of these women will not experience all these age-specific fertility rates throughout their lives because they will die before. Some of them will die before reaching 49. And also because we know that more boys are born than girls. So we have to give a discount there, right? Even in cultures that don't have a preference for sons. So in the US, based on this data, the fertility is below the replacement level because this number is below 2.1. And we see that the generation of daughters based on this data is going to be smaller than the generation of mothers. But then, so now we are taking into account information, the risk per age group. We're being really careful there. In the numerator, we have only female birth, but also we have to take into account that some of these women here, like I just said, they will not survive throughout all this period. They will not reach even 15 years of age, or 20, or 25, or 49. So in this, the total fertility rate, we are taking into account the different risks or chances that women would have a baby by age. The gross reproduction rate, we do that, but also only female births. In the net reproduction rate, we will also take into account the chances of women dying throughout their lives that will make them not being able to experience all these chances here of having female births. So we have to include the mortality component in the formula. And the way that the mortality component is done in the formula is by including this number of women surviving to that specific age interval. So in the life tables, what are the life tables again? Is this table pretty much a spreadsheet that you have the age-specific mortality rates by age group, and we usually calculate that for men and for women separated because women live longer, so they have different risks than men, so you do it separated by sex. So you get the age-specific mortality rates by age group for women, and you do an exercise to calculate the life expectancy at birth. That's the life table that will give us that information of if we expose a group of people to these mortality rates throughout their age groups from 0 to 85, how many years on average they will live. And one of the components of that life table that we're going to learn it's going to be this column called the big LXN, which is the number of women surviving to the beginning of that specific age group. And in this specific data here that I got, at the beginning of the life table, we assume that we have 100,000 births being experienced by women in that, based on data from 2012. This is just a standard that we usually use at the beginning of the life table. And then using the age-specific mortality rates, we calculate these numbers here. But just imagine, if we have 100,000 women being born, and none of them die until they reach age 15. And in this age group, we have five single ages from 15 to 19. So if none of them died, this number here would have been 500,000, right? The 100,000 times the width of this age group. So if no woman died, there was no mortality until they reach 50. Let's say that the women start to die in this population just when they reach 50. So all these numbers here would have been 500,000, right? But mortality happens. People die before age 50 in all different chances throughout their lives. So out of the possible 500,000 women that could have reached the beginning of this interval, only 495,615 reached there. And you see that this number will just decline because women are dying, right? So based on this information here and the radix, this little L0, this is a little L0, that's called the radix of the life table. This is the big LXN, and these terms, big L and little l, these are the terms used by demographers. You get this information here and divide by this number here multiplied by 5. You get the big LXN and divide by 5 times this number here to get what? The proportion of women surviving to the midpoint of that specific age interval. So what is this data showing here? So if I get 495,615 and divide it by 500,000, how much do I get? 0.9912. What is 0.9912? How do I interpret that? That 99.1% of women are surviving to the midpoint of this age group, up to the age of 17. And then 98.9 are surviving up to 22, and up to 96.3 are surviving to the age of 47.5, right? So we are just saying what's the proportion of women surviving to the midpoint of that age interval. We already have the age-specific fertility rates that take into account only female births that we use for the gross reproduction rate. We're going to use it again. You're going to pretty much multiply this column here, the age-specific fertility rates that take into account only female births, and we multiply by this proportion of women who will experience those rates. Because since let's say if I had 500,000 women here, how much would be this number? 500,000 divided by 500,000, this 1 times 5. 500,000 divided by 500,000, I would have 1. 100% of women reaching the age of 17.5. 1 times this would be exactly this number. 0.0143, because all women reach that age of 17.5 and they would all experience that chance of having daughters. But we have to give a discount because some of them are dying. So we multiply this number plus one number that's going to be below 1 unit. So necessarily this will reduce. Really small at the beginning here from 0.0143 to 142, but then, for example, here 236 to 231 and so on, 475, 468. So these ones here are the age-specific fertility rates only considering female births that take into account information about mortality of the mothers. Another way to say is the daughters per surviving woman during a 5-year interval. So considering mortality of mothers that they could die before reaching the specific midpoints here, this woman will have 0.014 daughters for every woman. If you multiply by 1,000, 14 daughters per 1,000 women in this age group, considering already mortality. So we just get these numbers here, add them all, and multiply by 5 in a similar way as we did with the gross reproduction rate, the total fertility rate. We add this all, 0.18, multiply by 5, 0.904. So we would expect, if we expose a group of women to these age-specific fertility rates that already take into account only female births and mortality of the mothers, you would expect that the mothers would produce 0.9 daughters, each mother, right? So this is the net reproduction rate. And the mean length of a generation, the average age in which women are having children, you get column 2 and multiply by column 10. You get the midpoint, multiply by the chance that they're having these kids, because what's the assumption of this formula here for the mean length of a generation? That women are exposed to these chances of having children, kind of like in a similar way throughout this age interval. So between 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, the rate is going to be the same. So I just multiply 17.5 by this number to get this number here. Add them all, get 25.8. And if I divide 25.8 by 0.9, we get 28.6. That's the mean age in which women are having their daughters. And all these formulas are related to what we saw here in the lecture, right? The mean length of a generation is exactly what I just did. I just got the age-specific fertility rate taking into account only female births, get the proportion of women surviving to the midpoint of each age group with information from life tables, multiply by the width of the age group, and multiply by the midpoint of the age group. For the first one there between 15 and 19 was 17.5, and divide by the net reproduction rate. So this is the mean length of a generation, is the mean age of mothers giving birth to live daughters with the current age-specific fertility rates and age-specific mortality rates, right? The mortality rates, they were taken into account with the big LXN. So all these formulas that we saw here in the slides, they are shown on this spreadsheet, okay? And usually we get the age-specific fertility rates and plotted in a graph by age groups. And that's what it's to the right of this table here. This is pretty much just the column with the age-specific fertility rate, and showing that women, as they get older, within the age group of 15 to 49, the chances of having children increase, and then afterwards start to decline. Okay? All cool? And the way that you calculate it is really similar. I mean, you can get this information for Texas, for Brazos County, for one specific city, but what you pretty much have to have is this 4 sets of columns here. The mortality can be harder to get for small areas, but number of women by age group, number of babies by age group of mothers, and number of daughters by age group of mothers is usually more, it's easier to find this information, for example, from the Census Bureau website. And then you can estimate at least up to the gross reproduction rate, okay? And you can do this analysis per year. You can generate one table like that for each location that you are interested, for each year that you have data from. Okay? Questions? Oh, good. So we saw this more technical way in these previous slides of how we estimate a series of indicators, right? We estimated the crude birth rate, in which the denominator also include men. The fertility rate, the denominator only include women. The reproduction rate, the denominator also only include women, but the numerator includes only daughters, not sons. So that's what I mentioned to you. These terms are important. Birth rate, numerator and denominator include men. Fertility rate, numerator, boys and girls, denominator, only women. Reproduction rate, only daughters, only women. Daughters in the numerator, women in the, or mothers in the denominator, okay? So now we are pretty much trying to understand, after we calculate all these different fertility rates, after we calculate all these different indicators, reproduction indicators as well, why in some countries we see higher fertility rates, higher reproduction rates than in other countries? Why some countries experience declines and sometimes increases in those fertility rates? What are the reasons? Right? So that's the next portion of this chapter. We estimated the fertility rates, here, this little square on the right. And now we want to know what are the determinants, what are the causes? And overall, characteristics of our society are the indirect determinants of fertility. These could be socioeconomic, cultural, attitudinal, planning, environmental variables. How our society is organized in terms of even like economic development, overall education levels, and all these other aspects of our society that make women be more or less inclined to have children. Cultural, attitudinal. In some cultures, women do want to have more children on average than in other countries. They might want to have 3, 4 children compared to other countries that women want to have around 2 children only, right? But these indirect determinants are important to explain fertility, but in this overall framework proposed by John Baumgartner, the main researcher on fertility in the world, he suggests that these indirect determinants, and not only he suggested that. First, we're going to talk about the demographers that suggested this before, and he kind of built on it. But what overall demographers mention is that you have these indirect determinants of fertility that influence some other aspects of women's life. And these other aspects of women's life are closely related to the fertility trends. And these aspects that closely affect fertility are called the proximate determinants of fertility. So what I'm pretty much going to discuss in these next few slides are what are those proximate determinants of fertility? What did different authors say? And now we have kind of like a little summary of the main important proximate determinants of fertility. These are the closely related reasons of why fertility varies between populations and within populations, and they are determined by the overall way in which our society is organized. So, Davis and Blake, back in 1955, they suggested the intermediate variables that later on Bongers would call the proximate determinants of fertility. So Davis and Blake, they suggested that there are some indicators that we can try to estimate that can be seen as the means for regulating fertility. And these means for regulating fertility, they call them intermediate variables, which is pretty much 11 variables through which any social factor influencing the level of fertility will operate. So you have the indirect factors, they pass through the intermediate variables to influence variation in fertility. And these 11 variables, they can be grouped in these three different, they can be organized in these three different groups. Variables related to intercourse, pretty much women having sex or the frequency of having sex. Variables related to contraception, and variables related to gestation. So these 11 variables can be organized in these three groups. And what Bongers analyzed later on in his studies, years after, he saw that based on empirical data from a series of different countries over time, is that out of these 11 variables, the intermediate variables that Davis and Blake suggested, 4 of these variables account for differences in fertility between populations, 4 of them. And that makes the analysis easier, right? We're trying to understand variations in fertility for different countries, or even for states within a country, or counties within a state. It might be hard to get information for a series of variables, like 11 variables. But if maybe we just focus on these 4 variables, that will already tell us a lot about why we see these changes in fertility. And the importance of 4 variables vary over time and over space. So what exactly are these variables related to intercourse, conception, and gestation? This is a table adapted from exactly the studies from Davis and Blake and by from the studies of Bongers as well, available in one of these textbooks that I have been citing a lot. It's not the required textbook, but I have been using it throughout the semester. And here we have the 11 variables broken down by these 3 major groups: factor affecting exposure to intercourse, factors affecting exposure to conception, and factors affecting gestation and successful parturition, where the woman actually have children born alive. What are the exactly variables that we can estimate for each one of these countries over time? Related to intercourse, we can subdivide them: those governing the formation, dissolution of unions, and those governing the exposure to intercourse within unions. So what's the average age in which women enter or start having sexual unions, getting married? What's the proportion of women never entering sexual unions? Amount of reproductive period spent after between unions, when unions are broken by divorce, separation, or when unions are broken by death of husband. What's the chance of voluntary abstinence in a specific population, involuntary abstinence, and sexual frequency, right? And what about conception, fecundity or infecundity, as affected by involuntary causes, but including breastfeeding? Because I mentioned when women are breastfeeding their babies, the chances of getting pregnant also really, really low. Use or non-use of contraception by mechanical and chemical means or by other means, more modern contraceptions or more traditional contraception. Fecundity or infecundity is affected by voluntary causes such as sterilization, female sterilization, male sterilization. And then about gestation variables. fetal mortality from involuntary causes, miscarriage, fetal mortality from voluntary causes, induced abortions. And what Bongers mentioned is that out of these 11 variables, the ones that are most important to understand variations in fertility are age of entry into sexual unions, so pretty much age in which women are getting married, fecundity or infecundity as affected by involuntary causes, use or non-use of contraception, and fetal mortality related to induced abortion, right? So those 4 variables, if we get data for these variables for the population of interest, we're going to learn a lot which one of them has the biggest effect on the variations in fertility. So the intermediate variables proposed by Davis and Blake, pretty much behavior and biological variables directly influencing fertility. And as I mentioned, that first diagram, other social, economic, cultural, and environmental factors influence these intermediate variables proposed by Davis and Blake, which in turn influence fertility, okay? So that table that I just showed you has the set of 11 intermediate variables related to intercourse, conception, and gestation. And here's just a summary of that table that I just showed, okay? Proportions of people who marry, length of time of married, frequency of sexual intercourse, contraception, voluntary or involuntary infecundity, and also the likelihood of miscarriage and abortion. And Bonger said, okay, you have all these different variables, they are important, but it's really hard to collect all this data from all these different countries, and mostly for developing countries might be difficult. So he tried to operationalize all these variables in more like a simple framework. That's why he kind of proposed these new terms, proximate determinants of fertility, to try to think how we can use this framework from Davis and Blake in using data, using indicators, quantitative data to analyze fertility changes over time for specific populations. So he designed these proximate determinants of fertility to facilitate us making empirical analysis of specific populations related to their fertility. And it's one of the most useful frameworks for studying fertility that we still use today. And see, he kind of mentions that there are 7 proximate determinants that he kind of like adapts from the 11 intermediate variables from Davis and Blake. Marriage and marital disruption, like divorce, contraceptive use and effectiveness, or death of husband, as we said before, contraceptive use, prevalence of induced abortion, breastfeeding, postpartum infecundability, waiting time to conception, risk of intrauterine mortality, and onset of permanent sterility. I mean, some words in English are hard for me to say. You can read. Sterility. Yeah, I think that's how it is, right? That's why my slides usually have a lot of words, because if you don't understand my accent or I cannot read a word, you can read the slide. So, the main proximate determinants are these ones here: proportion of women married, use of contraception, induced abortion, and involuntary infecundability, right? So those are the 4 main proximate determinants that he suggests. Proportion of people getting married, it's a measure of exposure to intercourse and to the chance of getting pregnant. Younger women are have less sexual intercourse, Households with both mother and father, there is a closer surveillance of their daughters, so that affects also the fertility of younger women. Mother well-educated, they are more concerned about the risks of their daughters having children when their daughters are young. So there will be more of that awareness passed to their daughters. And also societies that kind of like women invest in their education and invest in getting a good job and then postpone marriage and postpone fertility or postpone marriage, those societies will have lower levels of fertility. Use of contraceptives that can include both information about traditional and modern contraceptives, induced abortion, and the involuntary infecundity related to breastfeeding that prolongs the postpartum amenorrhea and suppresses ovulation, right? So basically, Bongard summarized like this. They are these indirect determinants of fertility related to socioeconomic, cultural, attitudinal, family planning, environmental characteristics of populations. And we have these 7 most important factors that directly affect fertility, and they are called the proximate determinants of fertility. And out of those 7, the first 4, proportional marriage, contraception, induced abortion, and postpartum are the most important variables, right? So out of those 11, from intermediate variables from Davis and Blake, he lists the 7 proximate determinants, and out of the 7, the first 4 are the ones that he mentions being the most important to explain variations in fertility. And how do you measure the first 4? Marriage, contraception, abortion, and involuntary infecundability. He proposes these 4 indices, right? And so he proposes indices of the first 4 proximate determinants for women between 15 and 49. So you try to collect this information for women between 15 and 49. And these indices, they range from 0 to 1. When they are closer to 0, there is the greatest inhibiting effect on fertility. So fertility goes down. 1, no inhibiting effect. So fertility goes up. The marriage pattern index, when 1, when all women are married, and 0, when no woman is married. So 1, when all women are married, in this index, we have no inhibiting effect. So the chances of women having children is higher. When we have no woman married, then you would have lower chances of them getting pregnant. So that's the greatest inhibiting effect on fertility. But of course, because now it's much more common to have children outside of marriage, this index can be adapted as well. This marriage index can also be, instead of using the proportion of women married, you could have, for example, proportion of women cohabiting. Or what you could see is that even using proportion of women cohabiting, those that are not, including those that are not legally married, even including those, that variable might not be so important in some societies in which there is. There are a lot of children being born outside of marriage, right? The contraception index, 1, when no contraception is used, so no inhibiting effect, fertility goes up. 0, when all women are using effective contraceptions, the greatest inhibiting effect in fertility, fertility goes down. Abortion index, 1. These 1 and 0 are really theoretical, right? You don't have a society that will have an index exactly equal to 1 or 0 in any one of these indicators. So 0, 1 is the range. Abortion in the theoretical example, when there is no induced abortion, No induced abortion, no inhibiting effect, fertility goes up. 0 when every pregnancy is aborted, that's the greatest inhibiting effect from abortion, fertility goes down. Postpartum fecundability index, 1 when no women are in the period of postpartum fecundability, right after having birth. When no women are in the period of postpartum fecundability, there is no inhibiting effect, so fertility goes up. And when all women are in the period right after giving birth, that's the greatest inhibiting effect on fertility, then fertility goes down. So he's pretty much suggesting 4 indices going from 0 to 1. If you want, you can also think about these indices in percentage terms, going from 0% to 100%, but in a really more feasible way to think about data that you might need to collect from different places in order to understand how these factors here directly influence fertility, right? And like something that I mentioned before, Stover's modifications and extensions to the Bonger's model consider some demographic realities in our more modern societies. So he suggests even use of sexual activity instead of marriage as the indicator of exposure to pregnancy, exactly because of women having children before getting married. Extension of the sterility index to measuring fecundability from all causes. Revision of the contraception index to consider the fact that uses of sterilization could become infecund before the age of 49. That's really typical in, for example, in Brazil and Mexico, women, when they reach the desired number of children, they immediately after they have female sterilization, they pass through sterilization. So they become infecund before reaching 49 years of age if they reach the number of desired children before that age. So that all creates a change on the estimate of total fecundity. So the idea here is to analyze sexual activity instead of just proportion of people getting married, sterility from all causes, not just related to some specific causes that were highlighted by Bongers that we mentioned here specifically in the table that affected by involuntary causes, including breastfeeding, and here we had sterilization, medical treatment, so on. So it's pretty much just seeing that these reasons of women not being able to have children, there are several different reasons, and Stover is just pretty much emphasizing that we should take into account all causes of infecundity. Okay? So the main idea here is we calculated all those different fertility indicators, total fertility rate, gross reproduction rate, net reproduction rate. Why are they varying over time? Why fertility is declining? Why is fertility going up again in some countries? We can use these really simple measures to try to estimate that. But if I have a society that these measures are not so reliable anymore because people are having sex before getting married and have a chance of having children, you can also use other specific indicators, okay? Cool. And now we go into more examples. So I'm going to talk about overall fertility trends and patterns in the world, and then go to the US. And the last portion of this chapter is talking about male fertility. That's a topic that's usually not analyzed so much because information about fertility is usually focused on women. But that line of study has been increasing these last years. So starting with world fertility trends and patterns. High fertility countries are those with total fertility rates higher than 3.2 children per woman. And that's the case of mostly all sub-Saharan African countries. And we expect some gradual decreases in a couple of decades. But remember, from the first lectures, from that table that I adapted from Hans Rosling video lecture, and still fertility high in Africa, and we expect the population in Africa to increase a lot by 2050 and then by 2100. But overall, we expect these decreases. So after 2100, the year 2100, we don't expect as many countries with high levels of total fertility. On the other hand, the countries that are known as being the low fertility countries are those with less than 2 children per woman on average. So countries with fertility below the replacement level. And that's the case of European, Asian, Latin American, and Caribbean countries. Some countries experience really low levels of fertility. Like that happened, for example, in Italy, Spain, and still going on in South Korea. And we expect that in the next decades, we might see some return of fertility to higher levels. And this is a topic that I mentioned to you before, related to what are called the period and tempo effects. If I have a group of women that, because of economic development, changes in mentality and culture, investing more in education and jobs, they postpone the age in which they have children. If their mothers, on average, had children around age 20, they might start to postpone to age 25, 30. When you have that, in the short term, you have a decline in fertility. So you pretty much experience a decline in fertility exactly because those young women who you would expect them to have children around the same age as their mothers, they don't have children right away. They wait for some more years and fertility goes down. But then after they reach a specific age that they want to have children, let's say 25, 30, fertility might start to go up again, right? So what happened here is maybe fertility was at a level around 2 children per woman for the mothers, and then their daughters postponed. So we see a decline here, and then an increase again. And maybe this increase will let fertility around the same levels as before. But in that case, if you get period data, you see fertility here higher. And here in the middle, you see fertility lower and then higher again. So in that case, you might, if you just go up to the middle here of these 2 time points, and you see that lower fertility, you might say, oh, women are starting to have fewer children. No, but that's just for that specific time point, because actually they are just postponing the age in which they have children. And then the daughters of these daughters, or the granddaughters, so we have the mothers, the daughters, and the granddaughters, maybe the granddaughters will keep the same pattern of fertility as the daughters, around 25 to 30. So you don't see that dip anymore. But if the granddaughters, in my example, postpone the age in which they have children compared to their mothers, then you might see another dip again. But the whole thing is this decline in fertility just a temporary effect or a long-term effect? If it's a temporary effect just related to postponing of fertility, what's going on with these fluctuations in fertility are called the tempo effect. And this term, tempo effect and period effect, it was used exactly by John Bongertz as well, right? And then proposes some formulas to analyze whether women are actually having fewer children, or they are just postponing the age in which they have children, right? So there are more advanced formulas to try to capture that. But some of the previous decline that we saw with period effect might be the result of postponing infertility, a temporary decline in fertility that will come back, which is related to this tempo effect. So period and tempo analysis in fertility you might hear a lot if you read more academic papers related to fertility. Those terms you might not hear so much in newspapers or in the media, but that's really, really common in more demographic papers, right? Kohler, Billary and Kohler, they kind of subdivided the countries that have low levels of fertility, because some countries have really, really low levels. So they call the low fertility countries are those with fertility between 1.6 and 2.1 children per woman. So they're right below the replacement level. And there were 43 countries back in 2013 in that specific group. Countries with very low fertility are those with total fertility rates between 1.3 and 1.5. 27 countries back in 2013. And the lowest low fertility countries are those with fertility below 1.3 children per woman. And there were 9 countries in 2013, including South Korea, Taiwan, Poland, Portugal, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Macau. Before I came to Texas A&M, I worked in a research institute called Rand Corporation in LA. And one of the projects that I worked there was actually funded by the South Korean government, that they were trying to understand what are the reasons why women are postponing or are not having so many children. Why women are not having so many children and the total fertility rate is going so low, around 1.3 or even lower than that. And that's because of how the South Korean society is. It's really expensive to get education. It's really expensive to get into good college. To get into a good college, beyond going to high school, you have to pay private tutors to get really good education and then get into college. And then families cannot afford that, so they usually focus on having just one child instead of 2 children. What was the name of that Oscar-winning movie from South Korea some years ago? Remember? Parasite. It's all about that, right? It's exactly those, the people that they think that they are tutors, the family that think that they are tutors and try to help the other more like the high income level family. Because that's how the society is. I mean, there's a lot of inequality, as you see in the movie. And the rich people, they can take their children to really good high schools, private schools, and pay extra money for tutoring, right? And all the movies are about that. It's about this unequal society, a lot of this crash that exists in social classes, right? And it's interesting that the movie explore that in a really interesting way. That's not just about money or education, even the smell. Remember, like in the movie, like even the smell that the rich guy didn't like from the poor family. It's just really interesting way to show everything. And that's really related to demography. It's really related to this. And you see actually both families had 2 children, right? So it's, I mean, in that example.
Well, I didn't watch the movie, right? I know a bit about it.
Right. Oh, sorry that I told you. But I didn't tell the whole thing. But the idea is exactly that, is you have a society that there is a lot of inequality. It's really expensive to raise children. And in order to have children accomplishing good things in life, going to good college and so on, they need a lot of extra education and extra money invested in them. And that's one of the major reasons why South Korea has really low levels of fertility, right? South Korea followed more this laissez-faire, free market style of society, in which everything is privatized and then becomes really expensive for certain families, and also an unequal society, right? And related to these trends in fertility, there is also a recent debate on depopulation. What is depopulation? It's pretty much the decline in population size. Most of the countries in the next 50 and 100 years, because their fertility has been declining so much, they expected to have a decline in population size, overall population size. And the one simple way to measure depopulation is with the rate of natural increase. Remember, in the first lecture of this semester, I mentioned natural increase. I remember that graph that shows the decline in mortality and then afterwards followed by declines in fertility. And the difference in birth rates and death rates are called, and this is called natural increase. And if you pretty much just get the crude birth rate minus the death rate and divide by 10, you have the rate of natural increase. If you have overall more deaths in a country than births, the rate of natural increase is going to be negative. More births than deaths, it's going to be positive, still population increasing in size. And the information of crude birth rate and crude death rate are 1,000, as we saw in previous lectures. We get the overall number of babies being born divided by the population multiplied by 1,000. Overall number of people dying divided by the population multiplied by 1,000. So this information is by 1,000. If we get the information by 1,000 and divide it by 10, rate of natural increase, information is in percentage terms, right? It's expected now Europe is passing through a really stable process in which like the population is not growing as much anymore. And the rate of natural increase has been around 0%. So rate of natural increase is reporting percentage terms because we are getting 1,000 from here divided by 10. And from some other countries, what you see, countries with 0 or negative rates of natural increase, Bulgaria, Serbia, minus 0.5%, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Ukraine, a lot of, Eastern European countries, when they pass through the end of the communist societies and they enter the capitalist societies, there is a lot of disruption in the economy, a lot of people getting unemployed, a lot of issues of poverty, and then people start to have fewer children, right? We talked about that before. In these countries, rate of natural increase around minus 0.4%. In Germany, around minus 0.2%. Italy, negative, and Russia now around 0%. But already now we expect Russia to decline its population size from around 143 million to 134 million based on projections to 2050. Okay. The total fertility rates at or near replacement of 2.1 are needed for a population to remain stable. And back in 2013, 79 countries had total fertility rates close or lower than the replacement level. And some countries with low levels of total fertility rates do not experience depopulation because there are still large numbers of women in childbearing years due to past high fertility, but also because of immigration, right? Some countries they do experience declines in fertility, but there is immigration, and because some countries still have a lot of women between 20 to 24, 25 to 29 years of age, because fertility was high a few decades ago, you still have a large number of children being born, right? So they don't experience depopulation now in the short term, even if they already have total fertility rates below 2.1. Now we have been experiencing lower rates of fertility in African countries, lower rates of mortality and immigration as well. And this trend will be responsible for depopulation, even in some African countries in the next 50 years or so. But remember, the continent of Africa is expected to increase from 1 billion people to 2 billion people in 2050, and then to 4 billion people in 2100, based on those projections by Hans Rosling. So still, there is a lot of population increase. But if you look at specific countries, because there is a lot of variation, of course, in Africa, then you might see depopulation from specific countries as well in the next 50 years. But the continent as a whole, as we mentioned, is still experience an overall increase in population these next 80 years. What are the implications of low fertility? With fertility decline, birth cohorts become smaller. This pattern of low fertility and increases in life expectancy leads to an aging of the population. So since you have fewer children being born and people living longer, you will start to see a larger proportion of people with at least 65 years of age. So the elderly population increases in proportional size. And we will see in the next decades also a smaller proportion of people in working ages, between the ages of 15 and 64. And all based on projections from the United Nations between 2005 and 2050, old age dependency ratio will double in developed countries from 22 to 44. So old age dependency ratio, what do we do? How do we calculate that? We get the number of people with at least 65 years of age and divide by people between 15 and 64. We multiply by 100 to get percentage terms. And what we are saying is that overall, the old age dependency ratio in developed countries will increase from 22 older people for every 100 people in working ages to 44 older people for every 100 people in working ages. So healthcare and pension programs not well equipped in specific countries that pass through an aging population might have some issues in terms of not having enough resources from the public sector to provide, to handle these large increases of the elderly population in terms of providing healthcare and pension programs. And that's something that I mentioned to you before in that chapter about age and sex composition. And I showed the graph of proportion of people with at least 65 years of age in a graph in the horizontal axis. And then in the vertical axis, I showed the percentage of the overall resources that the country used towards pensions. And some countries, and the example of Brazil is really clear, that still don't have a high proportion of people in older ages compared to other countries are already expanding a lot, already spending a lot of money with the pension programs. So there should be some reform going on that was not implemented yet. So all these things have to be thought for these countries passing through this aging population process, lower declines in fertility, and people living longer. And now we go to the US, fertility changes in the US. There was a rapid decline in total fertility rate from 7 children per woman back in 1800s to 4 children per woman in the 1900s. In the early 20th century, there was a sustained fertility decline related to economic development, related to industrialization and urbanization. And the declining TFR is just around 2 children per woman. Kind of like now it's around 1.75 children per woman in the US. And the peak was around 3.7 in the late 1950s. The rate of natural increase in the US is still positive, so still population size is increasing, 0.4% per year. It's the highest in any of the developed countries. It's still because you have a big cohort of women in younger ages, which are more likely to have children. And overall, we have also been passing through an aging population, and that's related even to increases in some diseases related to getting older. People, like a proportion of people now having dementia is increasing, exactly because people live longer, they reach certain ages, and they don't die for other causes. We start to have change in the disease pattern, diseases that are more prevalent, exactly because we see this aging population going on in the US. Adolescent fertility is the fertility of women between ages 15 and 19. Why do we care about adolescent fertility? Because when women have children in such young ages, that might have really important impacts later in their lives. Women that start having children in younger ages might end up having more children overall by the end of their reproductive years. They might drop out from school, drop out even from high school. And by dropping out from school and having more babies, they will have less economic potential to get better jobs in the future. And that will also affect their means or resources to provide, to pay for good health services for their children, right? So the Affordable Care Act was implemented here in the US, tries to deal with some of these issues, right? So families that are poor, don't have the means to access these really expensive health care programs, maybe with the assistance from the government and the Affordable Care Act, that might give some resources to these families. And the thing is not just about older people, but also the health of their children. Just to give an idea of the adolescent fertility rate between 2005 and 2010, it was around 48.9 per 1,000. So for every 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19, almost 49 of them had children in that period. Out of 1,049 of them had babies. In developed countries, that rate is much lower, 23.6 per 1,000. And in developing countries, 52.7. But between developed countries, there is a lot of variation. 4.5 in Switzerland, 39.7 in the US, 42.1 in Bulgaria. In developing countries, North Korea, only 0.6, and Niger, 209 births for every 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19, right? So just showed there is a lot of variation in terms of adolescent fertility. And these are adolescent birth rates for the world, for developed regions, for the same period. So the data here is exactly the same one that I showed before. And you see a lot of variation between the continents, sub-Saharan Africa and Africa as a whole, with higher levels compared to Latin America and the Caribbean. And also more variation within the continents, Middle Africa, Western, and Eastern Africa, variation between them, Central, South America, Caribbean, Southern Africa, a lot of variation in terms of adolescent fertility, and the lowest usually in countries located in Europe, okay? So the overall adolescent fertility in the US has been declining since 1940, possibly due because of the increases in the use of contraception. So among adolescents, there was a significant increase in the percentage of births to unmarried teenagers from 14 to 89% between 1940 and 2013. And I will talk more in detail about this, continue on this topic in the next class. It's now 2 p.m. And I see you guys on Thursday. Today there is no quiz because it's the first day after the exam. And here in this lecture, I did put at the beginning of it, back when I showed that graph for fertility in the US, I included that article here that if you want to read about the effect of the pandemic on fertility. Thank you very much, and I see you guys on Thursday.